The proofs of evolution debunked in Answers in Genesis Canada's video look more like a list of missteps throughout the years in regards to evolution. Missteps that have already been corrected for by the scientific community are very likely not claimed as proof by modern scientists. This seems more like a straw man fallacy because the ideas have already been corrected by scientists. A straw man fallacy is a logical fallacy in which an opponent's argument is oversimplified or exaggerated. This allows the opponent's argument to be portrayed as weaker than it really is. This weakened argument is then defeated while making it look like the original argument has been defeated. It is a dishonest tactic that I hope Answers in Genesis Canada is not intentionally doing because it would show their willingness to promote Christianity in an unethical way.
Many of the proofs I'd put my faith and trust in had disappeared without me knowing it. A hallmark of evolutionary thinking is the idea of change over time. And this notion certainly plays itself out whenever someone asks the question, what are the best proofs of evolution? Especially if we were to do so throughout history.
This is what I mean by this video seeming like a straw man fallacy. People asking for the best proofs of evolution are more likely interested in the current proof available rather than proof that has been disproved by scientists over the past decades.
What if we were to do that from way back in the day all the way up to the 2000s? For example, let's begin by asking that question at the time of the launch of the book that's the bedrock of modern evolutionary thought, Darwin's Origin of Species. Well, in 1859, you might have been presented with Neanderthal man as proof of our evolutionary ancestry, even though they'd been found 4 years earlier and had already been declared fully human by a professional anatomist. However, the release of Darwin's book fueled the search for fossils of imagined ape-like ancestors of man in the evolution-believing community.
It makes sense for scientists to look for evidence of Darwin's idea. Scientists could then strengthen or weaken Darwin's idea by finding evidence supporting his idea or showing gaps that need to be considered. Starting out, there were bound to be some hiccups in the process of interpreting data based on Darwin's idea. This is more of a learning curve that needed to be overcome by scientists of that time period rather than a weakness of evolution.
And lo and behold, 4 years later, Irish geologist William King decided to re-examine the fossil skull of Neanderthal man and promptly decided that he was an ape-like creature. And many variations of this idea were propagated as science and fact for well over 150 years afterwards. Today, of course, evolutionists have admitted their true humanity, which is why they're designated as Homo, which means human.
It is important to note that it was scientists that realized this error and fixed it. This was not an instance of evolution being debunked. It was a misunderstanding that was eventually fixed.
Neanderthals. And definitive confirmation comes from no less than Dr. Eric Trinkhaus, an evolution-believing paleoanthropologist, considered one of the world's foremost authorities on Neanderthal man, who's concluded, detailed comparisons of Neanderthal skeletal remains with those of modern humans have shown that there's nothing in Neanderthal anatomy that conclusively indicates locomotor, manipulative, intellectual, or linguistic abilities inferior to those of modern humans. Now, obviously, humans evolving into humans isn't exactly proof of evolution. So you can scratch them off the list, as Neanderthals certainly aren't proof positive of evolution anymore.
Evolution involves change over time. Not every instance of evolution results in the emergence of a new species. Many instances of evolution involve small changes that help an organism adapt to its environment. Neanderthals not being a transition to a new species does not debunk the process of evolution.
However, moving on to 1861, you may have finally found yourself presented with some rock-solid proof in the form of a missing link between dinosaurs and birds, called Archaeopteryx. Good old Archae was used for decades to convince people that a true transitional fossil between lizards and birds had been found. But alas, in 1977, an admitted true bird was found which dates, according to evolutionist methods, at 60 million years older than Archaeopteryx, which means Archae couldn't be the transition to birds from lizards if birds already existed. Professor John Ostrom of Yale acknowledged, We must now look for the ancestors of flying birds in a period of time much older than that in which Archaeopteryx lived. Indeed, far from being some unique dino bird, Archae shared much of its supposed unique anatomical structures with true birds that exist today, like the South American Hoatzin, for example. So much for Archaeopteryx as undeniable proof of evolution.
I doubt this transitional fossil was ever claimed to be undeniable proof for evolution.
Now, by 1868, maybe the most cutting-edge proof presented to you might have been the supposed shocking similarity of animal and human embryos, and the discovery that humans recapitulated or relived their evolutionary ancestry while developing in the womb.
This is actually a piece of evidence that was debunked. However, it involved the actions of a single person and not the science community.
Of course, modern science has shown that the idea that you start off like a worm, then become more like a fish, then become an ape-like creature, and finally a human while growing in your mom is absolutely ridiculous and would be laughed at by any educated person today. And Haeckel's embryo drawings have now been admitted to being completely fraudulent. Forgeries made by this supposed great scientist's own hand.
There can be dishonest people in any group, including religious ones. Do we call a religion debunked because one member of that religion made false claims? It is unfortunate that he used his position to spread misinformation. However, it was just one piece of evidence for evolution being debunked rather than evolution itself.
And the similarity argument has been shown false as well. And yet they were in textbooks up until my youngest daughter was in school just 15 years ago here in Canada.
It is unfortunate that textbooks are so slow at updating their information. At worst, this would cause a misconception that could easily be remedied with further study of the topic.
As evolution-believing embryologist Michael Richardson concluded, this is one of the worst cases of scientific fraud. It's shocking to find that somebody once thought was a great scientist was deliberately misleading. It makes me angry. What he, Haeckel, did was to take a human embryo and copy it. These are fakes. So obviously, these embryo arguments are no longer proof of evolution either.
Scientists were likely more upset that this dishonesty happened than they were upset about one piece of evidence being debunked.
Now, by 1879, you may have felt scientists finally had the proof of evolution.
This makes it sound like one piece of evidence would be considered proof for evolution. Rather, it is many pieces of evidence that support the theory of evolution. There is no piece of evidence that can be pointed to as proof of evolution. Even the avalanche of evidence already found concerning evolution is not considered proof of evolution by scientists.
As the American Journal of Science published an impressive diagram showing the supposed evolutionary development of horses, which found its way into many other publications and textbooks for years. Now, today, this proof of evolution has been abandoned because of the many severe challenges brought against it.
You correctly point out that this information has been abandoned. This is yet another example of the self-correcting nature of scientific knowledge.
For example, if the series were true, you'd expect to find the earliest fossils in the lowest rock strata. But you don't. In fact, bones of the supposed earliest horses have been found at or near the surface. Sometimes they're found right next to modern horse fossils. But instead of me listing all of the challenges here, I'll quote the evolutionist curator at the American Museum of Natural History, Dr. Niles Eldridge. I admit that an awful lot of that has gotten into the textbooks as though it were true. For instance, the most famous example still on exhibit downstairs in the American Museum is the exhibit on horse evolution prepared perhaps 50 years ago. That has been presented as literal truth in textbook after textbook. Now, I think that's lamentable, particularly because the people who propose these kinds of stories themselves may be aware of the speculative nature of some of the stuff.
Information in textbooks and displays at museums should be updated much faster than they are. This is most likely influenced by the cost of updating and laziness in the people involved. The slow process of change in these areas is not representative of the body of knowledge for evolution. Scientists are not using these sources to find evidence for evolution.
So obviously the horse evolution series isn't irrefutable proof of evolution either. Well, maybe by 1893, they'd show you the good stuff, the so-called scientific evidence of vestigial organs inside of us. These were supposed evidence of useless leftover parts inside us from our supposed evolutionary past.
This might be an example of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias can happen when people interpret information in a way that supports the ideas they believe. They likely did not know the purpose of these organs and interpreted this according to what could be expected in terms of evolution. Well, now, that is a very small drop in a very, very large bucket of evidence.
And by this time, evolution-believing scientists like German anatomist Robert Widersham was claiming that our bodies contained over 86 of these useless organs, including the thymus, tonsils, adenoids, valves and veins, the parathyroid, and the pineal and pituitary glands. Of course, not only have all now been shown to be functional, but some have been shown to be critical for life itself. Today's doctors would consider that old list laughable. And over the years, the list of so-called vestigial organs has shrunk to a handful of highly questionable examples, even within the evolutionary community itself. Even the most commonly touted of all, the appendix, is now recognized as a highly specialized organ with a rich blood supply that manufactures several types of antibodies. It's not some useless relic. And it's not just the fact that these vestigial organ claims kept getting knocked off the list. It's the fact that the whole concept itself is a terrible proof of evolution to begin with. Ultimately, evolution is about how supposedly new structures, forms, functions, and features came to exist, not about the degeneration of existing structures over time. Something that used to have a function but no longer does is no direct help to the story of evolution.
Evolution involves change over time. I think this can happen based on the environment of the organism. An organism that no longer needs a part of their anatomy would have an obvious advantage for no longer maintaining this aspect. A possible example of this process is the Mexican blind cavefish, Astyanax mexicanus. They no longer needed eyes because they lived in a dark cave. This might be the reason these fish changed to no longer have eyes.
So these once great proofs of evolution have ended up in the dustbin as well. Now, by 1912, you'd finally have been shown some truly dynamic fossil evidence found in a gravel pit near Piltdown in England. The skull of an ancient ape man dubbed Piltdown Man was presented as overwhelming proof of our evolutionary ancestry. And for 40 years, this supposed proof was displayed in museum exhibits and textbooks as proof positive that human beings had descended from ape-like ancestors, with hand-drawn scientific images of what the creature must have looked like. But once again, 4 decades later, the evidence was re-examined and revealed as a fraud. It wasn't even a good fraud, as you could easily see how the teeth from a jawbone had been filed down to make them look more human, and the bones had been chemically treated to make them look very old. It was simply a combination of an old human skull and a modern ape jawbone stuck together.
The actions of an individual or group within the scientific community is not representative of any scientists not involved. This was fortunately discovered eventually.
So much for that proof of evolution. But wait, by 1917, just 5 years later in the US, they found some powerful evidence for evolution when a Nebraskan rancher found what he thought was a special kind of tooth on his farm. And an evolution-believing paleontologist friend of his was excited at the prospect it must have come from an ape man. And after an artist applied a healthy helping of evolutionary imagination to his picture, he produced a portrait of Nebraska Man, a hairy ape man, along with his ape woman wife in a scientific journal. And this was touted as great scientific proof for evolution.
A paleontologist jumping to conclusions and an artist using the information given to him is an unfortunate occurrence. You can't claim to debunk this piece of evidence because it was already discovered to be false by scientists.
However, several years later, scientists confirmed that the tooth had come from a pig. The whole fiasco had nothing to do with apes or people. It had everything to do with evolutionary presuppositions that drove false conclusions, all based on laughably flimsy evidence. So you can toss that proof of evolution away as well. So we'll end here for now, but stay tuned for part 2 of Evolution Over Time, where we'll show even more examples of supposed proof of evolution that have come and gone.
I will keep an eye out for the next part in this series. Thanks for watching and please subscribe.